Today we're continuing with our studies in the book of 1 Samuel, and we're following the life of David. And today we get to 1 Samuel chapter 24. If you were with us last time, we looked at 1 Samuel 23. If you've got time, then if you would like to read 1 Samuel 24 and then come back to our Bible study, that will be helpful. I will be referring to most of the verses as we go through the study. But as we saw in 1 Samuel 23 last week, we saw how David gradually was maturing. He was beginning to take on many leadership qualities. God was using him, and God was working through David there. Now we turn to chapter 24. And in this chapter, David and Saul actually meet. Remember, it had been some time since they last met in the palace. But now they actually meet. Saul has been pursuing David for all this time. But it's Saul who will fall into David's hands here. It's not David who's going to be captured by Saul. And we noticed last time, God's purpose is clearly stated here in chapter 23 and verse 14, which tells us that Saul sought David every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. So at the beginning of chapter 24 here then, what do we have? We have David with 600 men. 600 men in a cave at a place called En-Gedi. It is an area of large caves. David had been living this nomadic existence. Last time, remember, we saw how he was in a forest, the forest of Hirath, and now he's in a cave. As we've said before, it's not easy to hide 600 men. But here is David in the cave. And Saul is continually being ruthless. He's determined. Every day he seeks out David to kill him. And he's just returned from the victory over the Philistines. Remember how the end of chapter 23, he was there and he almost had David. But then a messenger came. The Philistines have attacked. And Saul had to go off. And he had to go off to deal with that situation. So as we see Saul here, it's been written of Saul. Saul was running after David, obsessed with hunting him down, and his life narrowed into this murderous squint. He had one aim, he had one eye, and that one aim, that one thing, was to capture David. And at the end of chapter 23, we passed over this a bit last time, really. We didn't look too much of the last few verses. But in chapter 23 and verse 24, David is here in the wilderness of Maon, where Saul follows him. And there's a valley. And on one side, you've got Saul. The other side, you've got David. And they're looking, as it were, over the valley towards each other. And Saul engages in this pincer movement. He's about to come round and capture David. But then this news breaks of the Philistines. The Philistines have invaded and Saul has to leave the area. So here's David with his army of, we read there, his army of, just get the numbers right, the army of 600 men, wasn't it? Yes, the army of 600 men, let's make sure. And Saul is building his army. And against these 600 men of David's army, Saul enlists 3,000 men. So the odds, you could say, are on Saul. And he knows where David is. He knows David's in this area, in the area of En-Gedi. And he goes there to try and capture him. Then in verse 3, so he came to the sheepfolds by the road, which was the caves of En-Gedi, where there was a cave. And Saul went in to attend to his needs. Saul went in to attend to his needs. Now, either there could be two versions of this, depending on the translation. attending to his needs, meaning he had a call of nature. He wanted a private area. He needed to go into the cave. Or it could be that he was going to sleep, because the authorized says that he covered his feet, which may be a polite way of saying that he went to the toilet. But Boaz, if you remember in Ruth, when he went to sleep, we have that phrase, he covered his feet. And Matthew Paul, in his commentary, tends to go for that fact that he went to sleep rather than for a call of nature. But anyhow, regardless of what the reason was, Saul was in this cave En Gedi. And as we've said, it's a large cave. The sheepfold indicates that. It was large enough, in other words, to shelter a flock of sheep. So David's 600 men could easily hide in the recesses of the cave. But here comes Saul. He finds this cave. And the fact is that the cave that Saul finds is the very cave that David is hiding in with his men. Now, what would the chances of that be? But we know it's not by chance. There was a purpose here in God's planning. And as Saul attended to his needs, or he went to sleep, that very moment he goes into the cave where David is hiding. This is no coincidence, but arranged by God to test David, how David would react, what David would do, to train David, and to develop what we read is that godly heart of David. So as Saul comes in there to attend to his needs, it's timed and arranged by God. Saul has no thought, has no knowledge of that at all. Now, Saul would normally have been surrounded by his men, but here he is alone in the cave. And as David's men realize that Saul has come into the cave in front of them, they see the opportunity. Look at verse 4. Verse 4, then the men of David said to him, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as seems good to you. In other words, David's men are saying, look, we've got him. We can capture him. We can kill him. But what does David do? Remember last week, he didn't really follow the advice of his men, did he? In 23, the men didn't want to go to Keilah, but David saw that it was the Lord's will that he should do. So David is here acting with caution. As he sees Saul there, would it be right for David to kill Saul? He had the opportunity. Firstly, it would be against God's command in the Ten Commandments. You shall not kill. And clearly David now, in this stage of his life, was one who at every opportunity took the Lord's direction in all things. We saw that particularly last week when we saw how he used the Urim and the Thummim to decide what he had to do there at Hirath. But here he receives no word from the Lord. Not that he seeks any word from the Lord, but there's no clear word, no direction for David to kill Saul. So how does David act? He creeps up behind Saul. Does he attack Saul? No. All that David does is take a part of Saul's robe. End of verse 4. He arose secretly and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now, the word there, the original meaning of that word, literally means to cut off the skirt of the robe or the hem of the robe. But even in this, David has issues. Look at verse 5. Now, it happened afterwards, in retrospect, as David was looking back, it happened afterwards that David's heart was troubled. His conscience was troubled because he had cut Saul's robe. To cut somebody's robe was the same as an attack on their person. And as we'll see in a few moments, remember here, King Saul is in front of him. He's still king. And then David returns to his men in verse 6. And he said to his men, he explains the situation. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. David acknowledges who Saul is. He acknowledges Saul's position. He acknowledges Saul's authority. At present, Saul is still king. God has appointed him. God has anointed Saul to that position. Saul's future is in God's hands. It's not in David's hands. So David here is not harming Saul. He shows that David himself sees God as the sovereign ruler who does what he will and when he will. And until that time when God removes him, in David's eyes, Saul is still king of Israel. And look at the words he uses there in verse 6. The titles he gives him: my master, the Lord's anointed. Then in verse 7, David restrained his servants with these words. David's men, as we've seen, had other ideas. They wanted to capture, they wanted to kill Saul. I mean, they'd been on the run, being chased by Saul for all this time. But the original word there that we read, David restrained his servants. That word restrained literally means he stayed them or he restrained them. He quieted them. He explained the situation. He must have explained that Saul was still king. So David tells his men, and Saul returns to his army. And when Saul has returned outside the cave, then David leaves the cave. Now, we're not told whether Saul had actually noticed that David had cut the hem of his garment. But at last we have this meeting of David and Saul. David arose afterwards, verse 8, went out of the cave and called out to Saul, saying, my lord, the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped down with his face to the earth and bowed down. It's David here who takes the initiative. And all this time it's been Saul who's been taking the initiative, trying to capture David. Well, it's David now who takes the initiative, not Saul. And it's David who cries out to Saul, my Lord and my King, or my Father. Speaking of that covenant relationship, in 26 and 25, we have a very similar title. 26:25. Saul said to David, may you be blessed, my son, David. Well, there was that family relationship. David was Saul's son-in-law. So Saul turns and sees David. And David, as we see in that verse, acknowledges Saul. He acknowledges Saul's kingship. He bows down to him. Now, many men in that position, having been hounded and chased by somebody for weeks on end, would take that opportunity to hurl insult at this man. But not so David. David challenges Saul with these words in verse 9. David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men who say, indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave. And someone urged me to kill you, but my eyes spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. from that I cut off your robe and did not kill you. Know and see there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand. I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients said, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog? A flea? Therefore let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. So as David holds up this part of the robe here is a picture of Saul's royal authority. It's part of his royal vesture. And here is David bringing this message to Saul, that your royal authority is being removed. We turn back to 1 Samuel 15:27-28. There the prophet Samuel is rebuking Saul, and Saul tried to keep Samuel from leaving, and he grabbed his robe, and part of Samuel's robe tore away. And Saul was left holding the piece of Samuel's robe. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. As Saul saw that torn robe, his robe, in David's hands, surely his mind must have gone back to that message from Samuel. As David confronts him, God's word comes to him loud and clear. And to David, it's clear that he's not the judge, but God is the final judge of the situation. Verse 12 in the Living Bible says, perhaps the Lord will kill you for what you are trying to do to me, but I will never harm you. Saul would be judged. He would lose the throne. But in fact, it was God's business to accomplish that, and not the business of David or anyone else. So David uses this proverb as he quotes it to him. And Guzik says of this, wickedness proceeds from the wicked. David used this proverb to make a point. Saul, if I was really as wicked as your advisors say I am, if I'm really out to kill you, I would have done that wicked act in the cave. Because no wickedness proceeds from me, when I had the opportunity, it shows my heart was not wicked towards you. Therefore, let the Lord be judge, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. David tells Saul, I am still trusting God that he will deliver me out of your hand. Instead of finding a way out of the trial in his flesh, David did the harder thing. He trusted in God to deliver him instead of trusting in himself. So we are given then in verse 16 the actions that take place. David finishes speaking to Saul. There are the people, there are these two armies standing in front of them. And the people are looking at Saul. What's Saul going to do? How's he going to react? How will he respond? We read in verse 16, he acknowledges David. Is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He's weeping here, but these are tears of emotion. As we've seen before, a number of times, there has been no true repentance with Saul. And as you read through those verses, there is that promise of verse 21 that David promises to care for Saul's descendants, and that promise will be fulfilled. So what then do we learn from this passage? We see three things about David here. We see firstly that David shows reverence. David had been taught by God, and he now shows reverence to Saul's position as king. Eugene Peterson says this: as David was dealing with God, a sense of sacred developed in him. While he was living in that austere country, his awareness of holiness, of God's beauty and presence in everything, in every one, increased. David was above all reverent. He had an inordinate capacity for wonder. The Psalms, many of which come out of these wilderness years, are our main evidence for this. Yes, David could have taken that opportunity to kill Saul, but here he's showing a reverence as Saul is king, just as he shows that regret after cutting the robe. So David's reverence is seen here, David's respect for Saul, and we see David has obeyed God. And in David's obeying God, we see the way that we who believe should show our beliefs in the way that we act. David knew it was disobedient to kill Saul because God had put Saul in that position of kingship, that position of authority. And God was going to take care of Saul. David wanted this promise to be fulfilled, to become king, but he refused by his action not killing Saul to try and move things otherwise than in God's time. The promise had been given to David, he would be king. And there are times when maybe we have a promise from God and we think that we are justified in doing things and sinning in pursuing that promise. And that cannot be right. God will fulfill his promises, but he will do it in his way and he will do it in his time. We need to wait for God. We shouldn't be like Abraham. Remember what Abraham tried to do in Genesis chapter 16. God had promised to Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, and that son would be the one who would be the heir of all things. God's promises to the son, that through the son who would be born. But Abraham and Sarah tried to hurry up things. They gave up. They almost waited, nothing happened. So what happened? Abraham went in to Hagar and Ishmael was born. David knew he had to wait on the Lord, but he also knew he had to wait for the Lord. F.B. Mayer, in his book on David, says, we wait on the Lord by prayer and supplication, looking for the indication of his will. We wait for the Lord by patience and submission, looking to the imposition of his hand. David was determined that when he became king, when he sat on that throne, it wouldn't be because he got Saul out the way, but because God had removed Saul from that place of kingship. He wants God's fingerprints on that work, not his own. He wants the clean conscience that comes from knowing God's will. So there is reverence. There is also respect here for the king. David respects Saul's office as king. And this is a valid point at this time. Those of us who are responsible in leadership for churches, when we see the government at this time, the government has given us directions that we are to obey. And 1 Peter 2, verse 17, reminds us that we are to honor, we are to respect those in leadership over us. And so, as churches, we have that responsibility to follow the rules that the government has given to us. Now, there are some churches, mainly in the United States, who are making a stand against those rules that they are being directed to do. They're very much like our rules of worship: social distancing and no singing, various other things. But they're saying they can't abide by them. They're saying that there is a higher authority. They are rejecting the government's leadership. They are not respecting the leadership of the government that has been put over them. And then thirdly, we see that David, he had ultimate respect for Saul, and he also made the right choice. Just read a few words from Psalm 142 as we finish. Psalm 142. David, we know, was one who cried to the Lord. He sought the Lord. And in Psalm 142, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous surround me, and you deal bountifully with me. And then in Psalm 145, the Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. He will fulfill the desire of those who fear him. David's desire was to be obedient to God. He will fulfill the desire of those who fear him. He will hear their cry and save them. The Lord preserves all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. My mouth shall speak the praise of the Lord, and all flesh shall bless his holy name forever and ever.